Okay, picking it up again one last time this week for Chapter 8. So, understanding metadata. So, understand that the documents created by many Office programs, they contain hidden information about the creator and the document. And it's hidden. It's known as metadata. And we're not going to be able to change that. So, if we copy or reuse or borrow a document and start typing it, the metadata will indicate who was the original creator. And so we want to keep this in mind when we are recycling documents or if we're using documents created by another person. In programs like Microsoft Office, the document might list the original person as the author. You'd want to check that out. Then, of course, we want to understand embedded malware. So, email, back to the email subject, is an effective attack method. And ultimately, it can be used to infiltrate our system, right? Using oftentimes embedded malware in an attachment or in a link that we get with spam. And increasingly, attackers are using email to deliver these zero-day attacks. A zero-day exploit, as you likely know, is one that takes the advantage of a security vulnerability that was unknown previously, and it wasn't known until that day, and then they launch an attack, and now we're aware and responding to it. It's really not the way to do cybersecurity. We want to be much more proactive. So malware can easily be embedded in a PDF document or a Word document, Excel files. So not allowing attachments actually would simplify the whole process, but it would dramatically reduce the usefulness of email. So what we want to do is make sure that people are aware. We want to filter based on known attacker sites. We want to use a defense in-depth approach, which would allow attachments, but they're scanned for malware at the email gateway and at the email server and at the client server, for example. Hyperlinks, we want to be cautious. They usually have two components, the actual text and then the connection instructions. And so we might disable hyperlinks in an email and then make you, as the user, click on a button that authorizes access to the link. And that's right, an application of education in the process. So, which really is essential. Then, controlling access to personal applications is another approach that we want to take. We want access to personal email accounts that personal email accounts should not be allowed from the corporate network, right? Because Gmail bypasses all of our controls that we've set up, such as email filtering and scanning, right? And so uh, in this way, we're not able to address the outsider threat or the insider threat, right? And so the personal email is a way to exfiltrate data and send it out without any record being made. So we want to be careful of that. Then, of course, hoaxes. Hoaxes are deliberately fabricated falsehood, a story. Like, I want to hold $1 million for a prince in some foreign nation. No, I do not. Anyhow, that's just my view of the world. Okay. And so we want to ensure that we apply be aware of common email related mistakes as listed on these slides, and make sure that training is a part of our effort. You know, some of the most common mistakes are sending an email to the wrong person, hitting reply to all, or hitting reply when we mean forward, and it can have deleterious effects, of course, right? So we want to be sure and train everyone. But even email servers are at risk, right? The servers are hosts that deliver, forward, and store the email. So these really then are attractive targets because they're frankly a conduit between the internet and our internal network. So we want to make sure we harden their operating systems. And whenever you say harden an operating system, you ought to say an application too. And of course, the network, right? And all of the services that are not required on this email server should be disabled or frankly removed because the email servers themselves, the threats include denial of service. So in fact, two of the most common types of attacks are relay abuse and denial of service. So in a relay abuse, the default posture for any email server is to process and to relay or forward any information. So if an email comes to your server and it doesn't belong there, it's naturally going to forward it to the right location. And this is known as open mail relay. And criminals know that, and they conduct internet searches for email servers that are configured to allow this open mail relay, right? And they use it to distribute spam. So they might send a bunch of email not intended for one server, but that email server sees it, says, oh, this belongs somewhere else, and they're going to forward it. And frankly, we're using an email server to develop a denial of service attack. So in response, we can blacklist, right? Blacklisting is a standard practice. So we can have a list of email addresses or domain names or IP addresses, and if they're that are known to send unsolicited commercial spam or malware, and so we can stop them by a blacklist. Now, with denial of service attacks, the SMTP protocol is especially vulnerable here, right? Because by design, remember, it's supposed to accept and queue incoming mails. And so to mitigate this, the email server can be configured to limit the amount of operating system resources that can be consumed, right? So we want to limit attachment file size, for example, and ensure log files are stored in the appropriate location. We want to avoid things like a buffer overflow, right? The spilling over in our electronics. And that's going to help to stop the denial of service attack. And then there's logging. Logging doesn't get talked about enough, but it's essential. So NIST defines a log as a record of an organization's systems, like the workstations or networks, right? And systems, not just workstations, could be routers, servers, etc. So security logs are generated by these sources. Even AV software, firewalls, IPS, IDS, OS operating systems produce logs. Windows event logs. In fact, there are tons of Windows event logs, and you would not want to log all of them, but you would log 4 or 5 key security events in the Windows events logs, like a logon attempt. So to look for security incidents, policy violations, and fraudulent activity. This is how you would focus policy, controls, and standards that use standard operating procedures, etc. Right? You'd want to focus on what you need to know for security. So log management infrastructure is typically based on one of two categories for software. It's a syslog system, right, which is centralized logging software in a SIM, right, a security information and event manager. And so syslog is this open framework-based approach based on message and severity, right? And so a SIM, a security information and event manager, the software is often used in open or proprietary approaches. NIST does also provide guidance here, SP 800-92, Guide to Computer Security Log Management. So ideally, the data would be collected from every device and application. That's ideal, but let's be realistic. The challenge is the sheer volume of information. It can overwhelm any log management system, let alone us as human beings trying to operate it, right? So what we want to do is prioritize and include logs that have device criticality, maybe data protection requirements, maybe something that's vulnerable to an exploit, or even a regulatory requirement. We've talked in many courses like GLBA, HIPAA, FISMA, and PCI DSS. And you want to incorporate a group of people in this decision-making process of what logs to collect, like IT security, compliance, legal, HR, and maybe even audit, right? The types of logs to consider collecting and using. So log analysis is reliable and it is accurate, and it's going to generate alerts to warn you of things that it thinks are happening. So it's going to help you provide oversight. So what it does is it correlates data, which ties the individual log together with based on some other related information. It's going to correlate the two pieces, and it's going to sequence, which means examining the activity based on patterns, and it's going to look at signatures, which compares the log data to a known bad activity, and it's going to look at trend analysis, which is going to identify activity over time and that in isolation might appear normal, right? So trend analysis is important. It's also going to aggregate data, right, which is important. And another term I like to mention in logging is worm, is to manage its own resources. It's going to do worm, which is write once and read many times. So instead of writing the same log entry based on in 8 different things. So based on an antivirus log and based on a firewall log, it's going to write once and read many times, relating it back to that one. So a common mistake, though, when analyzing logs is to focus on the activity that it is denied, right? Where it's probably more important to focus on any allowed activity that might put the organization at risk. Just something to consider there. Now, firewall logs can be used to detect security threats, such as network intrusion, virus attacks, DOS attacks. We've talked about anomalous behavior or heuristics, employee web activities, web traffic analysis, and insider threats, etc. So, bandwidth. You might even monitor bandwidth monitoring, right? Do that, etc. So the key is that operational activities such as the installation of new software should be monitored too, because or the success or failure of patch management becomes essential. Server reboots. You even want to monitor policy changes. Is somebody trying to change policy that's been applied in a system? And I gave examples of a policy in a system as it's applied a couple weeks ago in an attachment on the weekly emails. So you want to have also be careful of logs when you are using third-party vendors, right? When we outsource operations, it can be beneficial, but we introduce vulnerabilities in that process, right? Here's the rule to always remember, right, for oversight. The rule is this: from a regulatory perspective, you can outsource the work, but you cannot outsource your legal responsibility. So you want to have third-party controls, which brings me then to the concept of due care and due diligence. Due diligence is the act of understanding security risks. This would be something that would be addressed by management or above or executive steering committees or the board. This is what we in security are trying to educate others, senior leaders. Due care means taking steps to address the security problem itself. So, due diligence might understand the need for an antivirus capability to stop viruses, so you could create a policy. But due care would go out, solicit vendors, compare them, buy one, and implement their antivirus capability on the network. Okay, that pretty much wraps it up. I've enjoyed our time this week. See you online.